This week's parashah is Parashat Shoftim in the book of Deuteronomy, and the Israelites are standing on the threshold of the land that is about to become their land. And Moses addresses them before his death, reminding them of all that has occurred since the Exodus and of the terms of the covenant that they have entered into with God. And he recalls for them their encounter with God at Mount Sinai, also called Horeb, at which time they asked that Moses be their intermediary with God. With that as background, let's look on your sheets, the handouts, at Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 22. You should have received it when you came in. I'll read. Adonai, your God, will raise up for you a prophet from among your own people like myself. Him shall you heed. This is just what you asked of Adonai your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear the voice of Adonai my God any longer, or see this wondrous fire any more, lest I die. Whereupon Adonai said to me, They've done well in speaking thus. I will raise up a prophet for them from among their own people like yourself. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. And if anybody fails to heed the words he speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name an oracle, which I did not command him to utter, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. And should you ask yourselves, how can we know that the oracle was not spoken by Adonai? If the prophet speaks in the name of Adonai, and the oracle does not come true, that oracle was not spoken by Adonai. The prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in dread of him. So I ask you, not rhetorically, but I do want to hear your answer, what's the central concern of these verses? It's expressed in verse 21. Beware of false prophets, right? But what's the question that verse 21 poses? Yeah, how do we know? How can we know if the prophecy is legitimate or not? And what's the answer we get in verse 22? It's not all that helpful, or it seems. Beg your pardon? It won't, right. If it doesn't come true, well, then it wasn't a real oracle. Now, what's the problem with that answer? Sorry? Sometimes things don't happen, but what's the problem with the answer? What quandary does it leave the Israelites in? I can't hear you.
What do we do in the meantime?
Yeah, thank you. What do we do in the meantime? We can't just wait to know whether it's going to come true or not. We could be in a crisis moment. We have to know how to act. We can't wait for the answer. So the question remains, how do the Israelites distinguish God's true voice? Now, I was drawn to these verses as I prepare for the High Holy Days, because I'm reminded that the challenge of discerning God's voice against the background din of all the world's competing demands on our lives is a challenge that we all wrestle with. And then there's the great tale we read on Rosh Hashanah, the story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Moriah, and you know it very well. God calls to Abraham to take his beloved son Isaac up the mountain and offer him as a sacrifice, and Abraham obeys. And only as he is about to lower the knife and take Isaac's life does God call out, "Stop!" For centuries, we've wrestled with this horrifying tale, trying to extract some meaning from it. Take a look at the beginning of the story. It's the next text. Genesis 22, verse 2. And God said, Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and bring him up there, the Hebrew is ha'alehu, as an offering on one of the heights which I will point out to you. The Hebrew ha'alehu literally means bring him up. It's the same root of aliyah, one who ascends. In the context of sacrificial worship, the term suggests a burnt offering, the smoke of which ascends, goes up. And the plain meaning of the biblical text is that God wants Isaac as such a burnt offering. But of course, once Abraham prepares to make this utterly unthinkable sacrifice, God stops him. So the rabbis, in attempting to make sense of God's contradictory commands, suggest that God only intended the literal meaning. God said, bring him up the mountain, Abraham, and when we're done, you will bring him down again. But Abraham, knowing that child sacrifice was common religious practice in the cultures of his time and place, misunderstood. That's one rabbinic reading answering the question of the confusion. Another seeks to make sense of the episode quite differently. It says that the first command, ha'alehu, sacrifice him, did not come from God at all. Rather, it came from somewhere inside Abraham. Because Abraham saw it was what other gods wanted, he believed it was what his God wanted. And in his zeal to serve, he projected his imagination onto God. Take a look at Rabbi Gunther Plaut on the binding of Isaac. A God who asks man what the text appears to ask is not the true God, but one whom man fashions in his own image. Man often believes that God wants him to sacrifice his children to an imagined demand. But then it is not God who is cruel, but man. It is man who all too frequently is prepared to immolate his offspring to satisfy his own concept of duty, and who will restrain his compassion before his own sense of righteousness. The history of humanity is replete with misdeeds committed in the name of religion. It's a very powerful insight on several levels. First, it speaks to parents who, truly believing themselves to be acting for the good, responding perhaps to such important demands as making enough to support their families, or pushing their children to do better so they will have better opportunities, inadvertently cause their children to suffer, and we've all seen it. And it speaks to all of us who in our minds and hearts believe ourselves to be making sacrifices for others, including those we love, and instead wind up hurting those we love and ourselves. And this week, which witnessed the tragic shooting in Minneapolis, I would suggest the text speaks to those who oppose gun regulations, but fail to recognize how too many children have been sacrificed on their sacred altar of the Second Amendment. And of course, the last words, the history of humanity is replete with misdeeds committed in the name of religion, resonate in the terrible tragedies unfolding in the Middle East. There are those who do believe that God sanctions murder, be they Hamas or other extremist groups, and who even martyr their children to worship a God of hate fashioned for them by leaders, guided not by faith's teachings, but by a fundamentalist corruption of them. And not to draw any sort of equivalency, but even those Israeli extremists who follow the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and insist on the Jewish people's divine right to all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, they too have perverted faith to political ends. My favorite answer to the question posed in verse 21, how can we know that the oracle was spoken by Adonai, is offered by the best-selling author Anne Lamott, who says, take a look. You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. This past week, we entered the month of Elul, the last month before the new year begins, the month during which we turn our focus inward and search ourselves for the very best within us. Days during which we try to listen more closely to discern God's voice. Our Torah portion this week acknowledges that it isn't easy. And if the righteous Abraham could be misled, how can we know if we're getting it right? The cacophony of demands on us cause us to confuse God's expectations with society's. I'll never forget the New Year's card I saw years ago portraying a rabbi dressed in traditional garb blowing a large shofar. And out of it are flying dollar bills, gold bars, and a Mercedes. Inadvertently, we pervert the meaning of the wish, Shana Tova. We want the best for ourselves and those we love, but we can at times lose perspective. How in these days leading toward the new year can we find it again? We can return to the book of Deuteronomy and the problem inherent in the Bible's test to discern true prophets from false ones, that the proof may be too long in coming. The commentators remind us that in ancient Israel, the role of the Navi, the prophet, was not actually to predict the future at all, but rather to remind the people of their covenant with God. Yes, at times the prophet would hold out the promise of future reward or punishment, but really only as a way of urging the people to live by God's commandments today. Their primary task was to impel the people Israel to build their lives on solid foundations, those of gentleness and justice and compassion and peace. And so we learn that while the future is beyond our ability to predict, the present is very much ours to shape. In the coming days, may we search inward to find our truest selves, and may we hear against the clatter and the blare and the hubbub of our daily lives God's commanding and loving voice.